Hello, my name is Olu Osha, and I like to talk about US presidents. And today I'm going to talk about John Adams. I'd promised to do a clip just talking about John Adams, our second US president, because he was very significant. It would not be an exaggeration or far fetched to say that possibly without John Adams, we would not have a United States of America. We may not have had a revolution from against Britain and independence as we know it. Because during the time of our founding fathers under British rule, the colonies, each colony was distinct, and they were like countries. In fact, someone from Virginia viewed Virginia as their country. Someone from Massachusetts viewed Massachusetts as their country. Now, John Adams, our second president, he's often underappreciated, but John Adams was shrewd enough to know that uh, even though while Massachusetts, they'd been the rabble rousers, against the British, he understood the importance of bringing Virginia, which was the richest colony, the largest by that time at that time, to bring them along. And so, John Adams did something significant in during the Continental Congress in nominating George Washington, the Virginian, as our, commanding general of the Continental Army. So that was very significant in trying to bring Virginia along. Now, and the second time that he also did something which was instrumental in bringing Virginia along and putting them, sort of at the forefront of affairs, even though, again, Massachusetts, people from Massachusetts were the rabble rousers in this thing. Everybody knows of the Boston Tea massacre, when the Bostonians also, dumped, the tea in the harbor, and everybody knows of Samuel Adams. How they were. He was actually a cousin of John Adams, and how they were rabble rousing, in Massachusetts and Northeast. But John Adams, understood the significance of bringing, the Southerners, Virginia, the slave owning states of the South, who were more of an agrarian economy. He understood the significance of bringing them along. So the second instance when he did this was in his nomination of uh, Thomas Jefferson as being the author of the Declaration of Independence. So John Adams was not alone in doing this, but he was one who proposed Thomas Jefferson from what was called the Committee of Five. They included John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and two of the other lawyers, an R. Livingston, and who was the second person? R. Sherman as well. So John Adams, in his biography, in his diaries, he'd actually written that Thomas Jefferson had a felicity with words. I think what he said was he had a peculiar felicity of expression, which was somewhat true. John Adams was a writer as well, and but he wrote in a very, uh, almost very difficult, ponderous manner. While yeah, Thomas Jefferson was, yeah, while he was rather florid in his writing, but he had some kind of paradoxical simplicity in his writing as well. So he brought along two important Virginians, uh, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, to take the forefront in their intent to declare independence against Great Britain. Now, it's not like the Virginians didn't have something at stake, right? Like, it wasn't like John Adams and the people from uh, Massachusetts were just manipulating the Virginians. Mind you, the New Yorkers were initially mainly British loyalists. They were taking a back seat, at this time. But Virginia actually had something at stake as well. Um, so the Virginian economy was agrarian, right? So they were landowning, uh, slave owning, you know, industries, if you could call it that. And the Virginians had an interest in expanding land to the west. However, this was controlled by the British Crown at the time. Now, the Virginians, they understood that if they could get rid of the British crown, that they would have control and access to the rich lands in the west of the colonies. So that was one incentive for the Virginians to, declare independence along with Massachusetts. And the other thing was the Virginian landowners, the slave owning fiefdoms or whatever you want to call them, they were uh, heavily indebted to British bankers. And so, if they were able to declare their independence from Britain, of course, they would get rid of these loans that they had. So, the Virginians also had an incentive. So, again, one of the significance of John Adams as a founding father was him being humble and shrewd enough to recognize the significance of Virginia and sort of putting them in the front seat. So that's partly a reason why you'll notice our first, amongst our uh, first five presidents, Virginians were four of them. So it was known as the era of the Virginia dynasty. John Adams was a break from that, right? So the first president was George Washington. He was a landowner from Virginia, right? The third president was Thomas Jefferson, another landowner from Virginia. And what's his name? James Madison was fourth from Virginia. James Monroe was fifth from Virginia. So you have the Virginia dynasty. And John Adams was the break. He was the only one who was from uh, Massachusetts. He was not a slave owner. He was not he was a lawyer. He was our first president who graduated from Harvard. He was our first lawyer president, and he had a very vigorous intellect. So John Adams was very significant, and something else that he was significant for was his traveling. Right, John Adams was able to do amongst the presidents, he did the most travel, right, by far. And in fact, amongst the founding fathers, with the exception of possibly Benjamin Franklin, but John Adams did he did a significant amount of mileage by road, which I don't think Benjamin Franklin probably matched. Uh, Benjamin Franklin had a very long career as a diplomat on behalf of the United States. He did several voyages to Europe. He was minister plenipotentiary ambassador representing America in both, an informal and formal capacity. But so did John Adams subsequently. John Adams was a minister plenipotentiary to a number of countries, to the Netherlands, to France, to England. He was our first ambassador to England when America became independent. And he did conduct a journey by road, mostly on foot, from France to the Netherlands. And he took his sons with him, John Quincy Adams and, of course, Charles. And, that's another thing I want to say that John Adams gave us. He gave us the president, the American president with the highest IQ, and he was the first father-son uh, presidency relationship. Of course, the only other father-son presidents we've had, would be George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. By the way, both of them, George W. Bush, the younger George, the 43rd president, is actually a relation of Franklin Pierce, our 14th president, through his mother. So there you have it. John Adams was a very important person, very significant person. And he is often underappreciated because of his temperament. He was a very direct person. And I'll give you a little bit of tidbit. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, very polar opposites, right? While John Adams had no qualms about being confrontational, what we'd call combative today, of course, today in retrospect and from his diaries, people say he probably suffered from manic depression or bipolar disorder, whatever. He was a very prickly person, he was hot tempered. Uh, by contrast, Thomas Jefferson was very mild mannered. He hated confrontation. His method was to stab you in the back, do it indirectly, and to manipulate. In fact, his voice was very mild. He talked in a very timid, shy way. But interestingly, both of them were good friends, especially Abigail Adams as well and Thomas Jefferson. They'd been friends. They'd both lived together in France, when they were ambassadors representing, the United States. And of course, John Adams did a lot of traveling on behalf of America, the early, the burgeoning colony, the burgeoning republic, to secure loans from the Netherlands and other European countries as well. And during this time, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams cultivated a deep relationship. And interestingly, however, when they got into politics, we were independent, they became uh, sort of enemies. They became cold towards each other. They didn't talk. They became rivals. John Adams' rival, for presidency was Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson was his vice president. And John Adams thought Thomas Jefferson was stabbing him in the back. And of course, they were rivals, and Thomas Jefferson defeated him. And John Adams was the first president who did not accompany his successor for his inaugural address or whatever, at the handoff, and he left, the very next day, or in the morning, back to Massachusetts. And so I think only two other presidents have done that. His son did it. John Quincy Adams did it as well to Andrew Jackson, and of course we know Donald Trump did it to Joe Biden, and in fact I think Andrew Johnson also did it to. Yes, Andrew Johnson did it with Ulysses Grant as well. He didn't attend his inaugural ceremony. So John Adams was confrontational. That's probably one reason he's underappreciated. He was a very brilliant man, very principled, and he believed in the rule of law. He emphasized the rule of law, and you can see it in his defense of the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. Even though he was passionate about, America getting its independence from the British crown, but he did believe that the British soldiers had a right to representation, and so he represented them, and he got most of them acquitted. By the way, his cousin was Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams became governor of Massachusetts briefly, and he was, of course, one of the main figures and a propagandist during the initial rabble rousing for independence against the British crown. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, interestingly, died on the same day, July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the American independence. John Adams thought that when he was dying on his deathbed, he thought that he would be dying before Thomas Jefferson, and he said those were his last expression, that Jefferson lives, or something like that. I paraphrase. However, he didn't realize that Thomas Jefferson had died earlier, in the early hours of the day. So on July 4th, which is rather interesting. Both of them carried on a very long correspondence, so we get to know a lot about the minds and the thinking of two great U.S. presidents. So my name's Olu Osha, and I've been wrongfully detained under color of law violation, pivoting on subornation of perjury and fraud on the court in Montgomery County, Maryland. The case number C15CR230000731. Of course, I'm interested in justice. I'm interested in the American Constitution, and so this is another reason why I'm speaking out against the violations of of my rights and every American's rights. When there's an abusive process in Montgomery County and obstruction of justice. In any event, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.